I didn't even know the Beatles were in India.
I was just a kid with a camera. The pictures, I put them away for 32 years. I just forgot about them.
Welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome to our show, and wonderful to have you here. So you were there, 67. Was it 67 that you were there? 68.
Yeah.
68. And then you made a documentary. You went back again.
They took me into their group.
Within 30 seconds, they really were just themselves. This is the bungalow where I shot those pictures. I went back many times, but
Yeah.
I went back as well to make the documentary in 2018, 2017, 2018.
Wow. How much has changed from now and then?
Well, the ashram was then a functioning ashram, and lots of people, and it was closed to the public because the Beatles were there, but there were about 60 people from all over the world taking a 3-month course to be TM teachers. We didn't see them very much because they were off meditating and long hours and lectures and so on. And the famous folks, as I refer to them affectionately, the four Beatles, Pattie Boyd, George's wife, Jane Asher, Paul's girlfriend, and Cynthia Lennon, John's wife, and Maureen Starkey, Ringo's wife. And then there was Mal Evans, their roadie, and Donovan, the wonderful folk troubadour and poet, Mike Love of the Beach Boys. There were basically 12 of them, and I kind of joined their group and hung out with them.
Well, let's rewind a little bit. What brought you there, first of all, number one?
Well, what really started it all was that I'm 23 years old. I thought my life was going very well. I'd already been the host or co-host of a national television show, a youth public affairs show. I'd already worked in the civil rights movement in Mississippi. I'd drove a sports car. I dated. I thought everything was good. And I woke up one morning in my little rented room in Montreal, and I was shocked with the thought that there were parts of myself I didn't like. I woke up one morning and thought, there are parts of myself I don't like, and I was a bit shocked. And I sat up on the edge of my bed and put my legs over the edge of the bed, and I said out loud without thinking. And the without thinking is a very important piece of this. The brain is a wonderful computer, but the heart is the guidance system. One of the most evolved teachers of consciousness I ever worked with said, if I had to sum up all my books and all my lectures into one sentence, I'd say it's all about integrating the head and the heart. All right? So I heard myself say out loud, without thinking, where do I go? And I heard my soul talk to me for the first time, and I didn't believe in a soul. I'd been brought up to believe. I was brought up as an atheist. My parents were sort of that way, and so there's no God, there's no soul, there's no spirit. That's just how I was brought up. But I heard this deep inner voice that was all calming, all knowing, all loving. And it said, and these were its exact words, it said, hey, Paul, if you really want to look at yourself more carefully, you might want to get away from the environment you grew up in. And I said out loud, I said, where do I go? And that inner voice said, India. And that was the end of the conversation. And I had no connection with India, mysticism, meditation. I didn't know what any of that stuff was. It was, it was the fall of 1967. Meditation wasn't a word that was in the language like it is today. Yoga, who knew what yoga was? It was a sort of peripheral pastime from the East or something like that. It was a different world than it is today. Mindfulness was not almost in the language then, except with people who found their way to mindfulness and the inner journey and yoga and meditation. None of it was common language. So that's how it started. And so I got myself a job. I didn't have the money to get to India. I got myself a job working on a National Film Board documentary in India. I knew the director who was going over. And what happened was I said goodbye to my girlfriend, Tricia. We loved each other a lot. I cried a lot. She cried a lot. We didn't want to part ways. I'd never been out of North America. It was a bit scary. And I took off for India, and I worked on the film. And 6 weeks later, I mean, I knew that I was looking for a different me. I knew that I was trying to see if it was possible to change consciously who I was.
What would you say? Would you say that your lives have altered since the Maharishi, that they've got more meaning or purpose or more fun or something?
I think our lives have been altering all the time. That's what life is. It's one continuous alteration, and you keep altering until you've made yourself perfect, or as near perfect as you're capable. But we have altered a little more, probably, since meeting Maharishi, because we've got something more to work on now. I mean, before we've known, I've been under the impression that meditation and yoga, things like that, have held the answer, personally. And yet I haven't actually had any form of teaching, whereas when Maharishi came around, he was ready to teach us.
But in fact, from what you were saying, it would seem as though that before meditation and before the Maharishi, there weren't enough answers, or from what John was saying last week, that life, implicating you here, that, I mean, that life, you had bad days and good days, that now there are more good days, that life has more purpose, that things like money and so on weren't enough before?
Yeah, well, I mean, we said that last week. It's just that the good days are very good and the bad days are okay, you know, just through tapping me source of energy.
And after 6 weeks of shooting across India, we got to New Delhi, and I got a letter from her, and I excitedly opened it, and the first line was, "Dear Paul, I've moved in with Henry." And I was devastated. I was shattered. I was...
Dear Paul.
You know, we've all had heartbreaks, I think, right? Most everybody has had a heartbreak at least. But this was the most devastating I experienced. And someone said, "Why don't you try meditation for the heartbreak?" Someone I knew for 3 days. He's American, named Al Bragg. I've been trying to find him to say, I said thank you way back then, but there's a whole different thank you I'd like to make to him. But
here's your time right now. You go, "Hey, Al."
Hey, Al, thank you. And so he said, "I'm going to hear the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi speak at New Delhi University tonight." I didn't know who that was. "Would you like to come?" And I said yes. And we went, and there was, you know, the auditorium was jammed. We got lost on the way. So by the time we arrived, it was just about to start. There were no seats. We pressed our backs up against the wall at the back. And I only remember one thing the Maharishi said, but it was the thing I needed to hear. It was the reason I, you know, went there or got there or was guided to go there or was invited to go there. He said, "Meditation takes you beneath and below your daily worries and concerns to a place of inner rejuvenation from which you come back renewed and refreshed." And I thought, that's what I need. You know, like, whoa, that's what I need. So I took a train to Rishikesh, and I found my way to the ashram by asking people, do you know where the Maharishi's ashram is? I didn't know that Rishikesh had and still has many ashrams. But I found my way to the gate, and they called someone to the gate who spoke English, a lovely young man named Raghvendra, who turned out to be my angel. I said, "I've come to learn meditation," and he said, "I'm sorry, the ashram's closed because the Beatles and their wives are here," which I didn't know. I was a fan. I saw them in '64 here in Toronto live. It was the most electric concert I've ever seen. And I came out of the meditation room, and I was in a state of bliss. I was stoned. I was high from the meditation.
Wow.
And George Harrison later said to me, "I get higher meditating than I ever did on drugs." And I knew what he meant because I'd experienced it. Anyway, I walked out into the sun, and I'm walking through the ashram, which is pretty small. You know, it's like, I don't know, a few acres, a bunch of acres. It wasn't big. And I wasn't thinking of Beatles at all. They were not in my mind at all. I was just so relieved not to be in agony, and I'm looking at the monkeys and the trees and these big, lovely green parakeets, and I'm walking through the ashram in a state of bliss. So that was, and then I saw them sitting at a long table by the cliff.
When was the point when you started taking out the camera around them, or you were thinking, maybe I shouldn't do this around them right now is not the time?
Well, that's a great question, because the answer is very interesting. Life is very interesting. I see them sitting at a long table by the cliff. I'm about 150 feet away. I can only see John, who's sitting semi-facing me, and I can see the back of Paul's head and the side of his head, so I can tell he's sitting talking to Paul. I can't see the rest of the people because of the trees and foliage, and I just walked over, but I was in this state of bliss, right? I was in this very calm inner state. I walked over, and when I got to the edge of the table, I could see that all the 12 people I mentioned, the famous folks, were sitting there having tea and cookies. And they were talking, so I didn't want to interrupt. So I just stood there. So I'm standing 1.5 feet from John and 1.5 feet from Paul on the other side. And after a moment, they clearly realized somebody was standing there. So they stopped talking, and John looked up at me. And I just said, "May I join you?" And he said, "Sure, mate, pull up a chair." And Paul pulls a chair in next to the end of the table, and Paul says, "Come and sit here." And I sit down. And 3 magical things happened. Magical, I looked it up in the dictionary years later and found the meaning that I was really referring to. It says magical, that which is real, but we as yet do not understand, right? It's like a magic trick. Mm-hmm. It's real, but it's not really. The ace of spades isn't really disappearing, right? But it is. So I sat down and 3 magical things happened. The first thing, as soon as I sat down, to my shock, I hear a scream in my head. Eek, it's the Beatles. Now, I never screamed, eek, it's the Beatles. I never spoke those words ever, but it was the fan, right? It was the fan coming out unexpectedly. Took out my camera twice, and I'll tell you how that unfolded, but I could have had my camera out all the time. I had lots of film. I only took 72 transparency, Ektachrome 64 colored slides, and of the 72 pictures, about 50 have anybody famous in them. It wasn't a thing. I wasn't thinking, oh, I'm going to get pictures of the Beatles. It wasn't literally, I didn't even think of saying, let's get a photo together. I could have had myself in pictures with them because they took me into their group. They just took me into their small group. I never thought of asking for an autograph. I mean, literally, I didn't think, oh, I'd like a photo. No, I shouldn't ask. The thought never entered my brain. So I just took out my camera twice. And I did that after asking them each individually, after the first 2 or 3 days of hanging out, and we're just hanging out and chatting, and they have cameras and they're taking pictures of each other like a family outing. And they were really like a very close family. You know, the four of them were like this. They were like intimate brothers. And you could kind of feel that the partners, the wives, Jane Asher, while close, although John and Cynthia weren't close, you could see that. You could tell that the wives were a next circle out. The inner circle was these 4 brothers who, you know, took the world by storm and were incredibly close. But after a couple of days of hanging out and seeing them taking pictures, I asked each of them individually, because it wasn't like, hey, Beatles, can I take your picture? I just said to Paul one day, are you okay if I take the odd photo? And I did that with each of them alone so they could feel free to say no. And they each said, oh, take all the photos you want. But like I said, I didn't take very many at all.
Took this pain in your heart. You go and you get your head together. You make this documentary, right? This comes out right here. What happened to Trisha?
Good question. In fact, no one's asked that. So really good question. I went home ostensibly to see if we could get back together. My best male friend and one of my best female friends, who were a couple, she was Trisha's sister. And in fact, I'd introduced that couple to each other. They came to pick me up at the airport and they said, do you want to come home and see Trisha? And for whatever reason, you know, I was jet lagged, I was tired, I was still I was still heartbroken. I just wasn't in agony. And I was afraid to go see her right then, being exhausted. And I said, no, maybe tomorrow. So they dropped me home, and then they went home to their place. And Tricia came running to the door. They told me later. She came running to the door, looking past them to see me. And I wasn't there. And she never wanted to see me again. We were too young. We were both in pain. We were both in heartbreak of a various kind. And we just, were like ships passing in the night. I did see her later, but she just wasn't interested in. And we didn't know how to talk to each other. We were young. She was 22 by then, or I was 24, barely. And instead of sitting down and saying, hey, are you okay? How are you doing? Just having a real human conversation. We were too scared to sit down together. Now, years go by. I was broke. And I needed to make money. I needed to rent a flat. I wanted to say to people, whoa, there's this thing called meditation. I literally wanted to say, there's this incredible thing, you should check this out. So I went to Canada's national magazine, Maclean's magazine. They wanted the pictures that nobody had. I wanted to write about meditation, and I needed to make some money. So I did a story for them. They put it on the cover story. And I finished writing the story, and I submitted it, and I'm packing up my slides because I used them to guide me in part in the storytelling, looking at the pictures. And I packed up my slides, and I'm literally wrapping elastic around them and writing India 68 on them. And I realized I was feeling bad. I didn't know why. I was feeling badly for whatever reason. And I said out loud without thinking, there it is again. I said out loud without thinking, why am I feeling bad? And I heard my soul talk to me for the third time in my life. And it said, you're talking about this too soon. You need to let the experience go deeper within yourself. And I remember the next thought was, I don't want to do anything more with these, as I put the slides away. What I didn't know then, and I learned many years later, I didn't think about those slides for 32 years. Wow. I married an Indian woman, never told her I'd been in India with the Beatles. Had a daughter, never thought of saying, my two best friends, when I finally found the slides 32 years later, because my daughter remembered a childhood story and asked me if she could see them. And that, of course, is in the film, the story.
Yeah.
It was wonderful to make Meeting the Beatles in India, because I got to not only see Pattie and Jenny again, I not only got to go find Bungalow Bill in Hawaii. I said to Ricky Cook, that's his real name, Bungalow Bill. They wrote the song about him. I'm sitting with him at his place in Hawaii, and we're filming. And I said to him, so when we finished filming, I said, so have a lot of people been here to interview? He said, you're the first.
That's crazy.
Crazy. And he's beautiful and wonderful. And of course, you saw in the film how Pattie was so thrilled to hear about his change of heart from a white hunter to a photographer of wildlife for National Geographic and a meditator.
Yes.
So to make the film, to tell the story of how it all happened, to, in a sense, also pay tribute to all those people who were part of it, and to my daughter who's in the film, because without her, the pictures might still be sitting in a cardboard box in the basement without me thinking about it. So after I did find them, after she reminded me, I decided to do something with them. But I didn't know if they were worth anything. Were there lots of these pictures? And my daughter, Devyani, and I were going through London on the Middle East. And I made an appointment to see Stephen Maycock at Sotheby's Auction House in London, because he was the curator for rock and roll memorabilia, and he was considered one of the top 2 or 3 experts in the world on rock and roll memorabilia, including photography. So I made an appointment to see him. And there was this really marvelous moment. We're sitting around a light box, And it's my daughter and me and him and his assistant in this room that was so small, literally our knees were touching each other around this light box. It was like a cupboard off a lobby, this room. And he takes a loop, the thing you look at the slide with. He takes a loop and he looks at the first slide. And without lifting his head, he goes, huh. And then he moves the loop and he looks at the second slide and he says, wow. And he sits up and he says to me, you sure you're not a professional photographer? And I said, no, I was just a kid with a camera. I've never been a professional photographer. Then he looked at the rest of the 54 slides with anyone famous in them. And he sat up and he said this sentence. It was so beautiful. He sat up and he said, we see everything for moments like this. Some of these are the best intimate shots we've ever seen of them. What do you want to do with them? I said, I don't know. What can I do with them? And he said, well, we can auction them off for you. And I said, well, who would buy them? And he said, well, it could be Apple because they buy back everything they can to control the brand of the Beatles. It could be they. It could be a photo agency who will resell them. It could be a private collector who just wants them. And I said, so what might I get if you auction them? And he said, well, it depends who's in the room. 30, 40, 50,000 British pounds. Well, at that time, 50,000 pounds was over 100,000 Canadian dollars, which I could have used. But for some reason, and I think it's the inner guidance that was guiding me already, the soul, for some reason I said to him, gee, that sounds boring. Do you think there's a book here? And he said, I'm sure there is. If I can ever help you, let me know. So I made an arrangement to do the first book with Penguin Putnam in New York. I called up Stephen Maycock and said, hey, will you write the introduction of the first book and just put the pictures in historical perspective like you did when I met you? And he said, sure, and he did that. And what happened was that the Penguin Putnam imprint that did my first book, the Viking imprint, the guy who ran the Viking imprint was a frustrated painter who had a big attitude. And I said to him, I'd love to go over and see the book being printed. I'd already approved. I worked on the design. They sent me to Vancouver where the designer was. We did all that, approved all the pages. And then I said to him, I'd like to go to China on my own expense. I've never done a book. I want to see how it's done. And he put his hands up like this. I'm sitting across the desk. He puts his hands up like this and says, that's what we do. So he wouldn't tell me where it was being published. And I found out later that they never sent anybody to supervise, which I also found out later that with an art book or a photography book, you absolutely have to have either the artist, the photographer, or someone repping them who's on the printing presses saying, I approve it. Because what came back was a beautiful book that was poorly printed. There's pictures of George where you can't see his eyes because they're shadows. Well, you look at the original slide, you can see his eyes. So when I got the first print and I looked at it, I was delighted that the book was beautifully designed, and it is a pretty trippy book in its design and in everything else in the storytelling, but the pictures they're not up to professional quality, because what they did was they picked the wrong paper to print on, and the paper soaked up the ink. This is what I found out later. So what happened was that I decided literally in that moment of looking at the first one I had in my hands, I thought, one day I'll do this myself to do it right. And so 5 years later, I could pull the money together, and I found a company that did limited edition books, because I didn't know how to do one. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know, And I said, I spoke to the head of the company, Insight Editions in San Francisco. The head of the company is a guy named Raoul Goff, who's a brilliant designer and a lovely human being and a brilliant businessman. They were doing limited edition books for George Lucas and, high-end stuff. And I said, I've got this stuff and I'd like to do a book. And he said, well, can you send me a few of the pictures? Low res. So I sent him a few of the pictures, and he called me back and he said, well, we'd be honored to publish it. And I said, thank you very much, but I want to pay for it myself. And I'd like you to manufacture it, but I'd like to put it out there because I want to retain control. And he said, we'd be delighted to do that. So I paid for the book. Interestingly enough, it cost me about $100,000, but I managed to pull that together.
Wow.
And that was 2004, 2005. And I put out a limited edition, big format in a clamshell box with a DVD and a CD, and we printed the pictures beautifully. And they knew how to do this, and they weren't arrogant like the first person. So what you're looking at there is what's called the special edition. It's the lower priced one. There's 1,968 copies of that for the year 1968, and the box itself is wrapped in linen.
Okay.
And it's printed. The book itself is wrapped in linen, and it's printed on high quality photographic paper. And you look at the pictures, and yep, that's it. That's what the real pictures look. An inch plate camera, formal portrait camera. It was set up by the Maharishi, as I say affectionately, it's the class photo. It was to include all the meditators who were on the course, plus the famous folks who he put front and center, as you see there in the picture. And the Maharishi told everyone where to sit. He had a seating plan. He told everyone where to sit, and he directed the photographer, stand over there, please stand over there. But what happened was that I went and got my camera from the tent because all this was happening. It was one of the 2 times I took my camera out. And when I came back with my camera, Ringo, seeing me with my camera, calls me over and says, hey, can you take some pictures for me? And he gives me his Nikon because he's going to be in the picture. And seeing that, George says, can you take some pictures for us? And he gives me his camera. And Mal Evans says, can you take some pictures for me? And he gives me his camera. So there were only the 2 of us that I know taking pictures at that moment, but I had 4 cameras that I took pictures for Mal and George and Ringo. It turns out that when the anniversary was coming and I was put out the books and so on, I'd get interviewed a whole bunch, Time Magazine and Life and Japanese magazines and German magazines. And I would say, if you want any of the pictures, my agency in New York is Contact Press Images. You can make an arrangement to use pictures. And the articles would come out, and I'd have given time to be interviewed and tell stories, which is fine. And they would never use my pictures because they could buy a picture from Mal Evans' camera much cheaper, because Getty Images had Mal's collection, and they'll sell them for $79 or $99 because they're selling, of course, a gazillion dollars of pictures a year. The Getty archive, the Getty agency is humongous. It turned out later that Getty had to make some kind of amends because it turned out they were selling 20,000 photos they didn't have the rights to. They were just collecting and selling, and until you stood up for yourself, if it was one of these pictures that they didn't have the rights to. So I got in touch with Getty when these pictures were appearing and people weren't buying mine. And I just thought, hey, you're asking me my stories and my time. At least use my pictures. That's fair. I'm not being paid for the interviews. That's fair enough, right? And so what happened was I got in touch with Getty, and they said bugger off. And I got in touch with their Canadian... yeah. And I got in touch with their Canadian lawyer because I'm in Canada. I thought that would work better. And she said, well, those aren't your pictures. Those are Mal Evans' pictures. Well, I'd already done my homework. And it turns out that the copyright for the picture is not from who owns the equipment. It's from who takes the photo. Who is the artist who frames the picture and sets the exposure in the picture. That's Mal. He couldn't have taken that picture. He gave me his camera. So finally, they got off their standard lawyer's position for the big corporation, which is bugger off, kid. And they said, okay, all right, we're not going to acknowledge that you took that picture, but we'll make a deal with you. Yeah. And so they paid me some back royalties, and they pay me a small amount of royalties now if they use the picture. And usually the picture that gets bought, I've sold some of mine through the agency for big articles, but usually magazines or newspapers will, of course, go for the cheapest picture you can get. It's not as good a picture in literal terms. I took it, but the facial expressions aren't as open and present and looking at the camera quite in the way as the main picture that I took. But that's all good. It's all good.
Yeah.
But that's the story behind that.
That is. And I'll put the links where you could go look for the book, The Beatles in India. But Paul, thank you. Give our love to your daughter,
My
because she's the
pleasure.
reason that we got the pictures back. Thank you, my friend. Thank you for coming on here. We'll let
Thank
you go.
you, all of you. Thank you. Please thank Amber for me.
I will. And all the links will be in here. You could follow Paul and get all his good stuff. Big
Thanks,
love to you,
Stefan.
Paul. Bye-bye.
Great. Bye-bye.
All links are down below. And also, please don't forget one thing, people, to subscribe. If you like this channel, right there, hit that little guy, hit the bell to be notified when we're coming on.
Until then, everybody, we love you, baby. We do. See you all later.